Architect Michael Querido is the project officer of Escuela de Filipinas. He received his BS architecture degree from the Polytechnic University of the Philippines, Manila, under Escuela de Filipinas Foundation, Incorporated. He was able to handle the rehabilitation of the San Agustin Church's 400 plus year old choir lofts, hilerias, or choir stalls. He handled several projects like the Preventive Conservation Demonstration Project being conducted at Paco Park, Oswari from 2017 to 2019. The conservation of Santa Monica's Parish Church, retablo or altarpiece from 2018 to 2019, the conservation of Holy Rosary Parish Church in Angeles City, Pampanga, and currently the conservation of La Loma Old Cemetery Chapel. Last August 2018, he was chosen to participate in First Aid to Cultural Heritage in Times of Crisis, held in the Netherlands. The said program was jointly organized by the Prince Claus Fund for Culture and Development, ICROM, and the Smithsonian Institute, with the overall goal to create the network of proactive cultural first aiders whose role is to protect cultural heritage during a complex emergency with the aim of to promote recovery, peace, and risk reduction. Currently, Architect Querido is also a mentor of the FAR Call Asia program organized by ICROM. I now present Architect Querido.
Okay. Hello po, magandang umaga. Thank you for the introduction, Dr. David. Let me just share my screen. Okay, the title of my presentation for today is Culture Cannot Wait, Disaster Risk Reduction and Management for Cultural Heritage. But before, bago ko simulan ng presentation ko, dahil parang sobrang aga pa, just to break the ice, meron lang akong papakitang mga ilang slides just to, para ma-recall lang natin yung mga nakaraang disasters na nangyari dito sa Pilipinas and also in abroad. So, let me know kung natatandaan nyo pa yung iba. So, pwede nyong ilagay sa chat kung alam nyo yung mga sagot sa mga, o kung alam nyo yung mga pictures na isa-send ko. So, let me start this one. This is where, saan to? Okay, so siguro sige, ako na lang sasabi. So this is in Maribohok Church in Bohol. This is the after the magnitude 7.2 Bohol earthquake. So next one, ito naman, this is in Palo Cathedral, Leyte. This is the aftermath of Typhoon Haiyan or Typhoon Yolanda noong November 3, 2013. Ito naman is in, ayun, ito yung Bato Mosque in Marawi. The mosque was really damaged during the Marawi siege last May to October 2017. And ito naman, sinong nakakaalam nito. So, hindi ko kasi nababasa yung chat. So, kung may mga sumasagot, sorry kung hindi ko nababasa. So, ito naman is yung mga heritage houses sa Buwak, Marinduque. So, several heritage houses were engulfed with fire last July 3, 2018. And ito naman, this is a museum. Hindi ito yung So, this is the National Museum of Brazil. So, over half of the 20 million artifact collections of the museum were destroyed during the fire last September 2, 2018. Ito, I think, very familiar to sa lahat ng participants. So, this is in Notre Dame Cathedral, France. So, last April 15, 2019, a fire destroyed the cathedral's roof and toppled its fire. Luckily, the firefighters saved the main bell towers and outer walls of the cathedral from the collapse. No. Balik tayo sa Pilipinas. Ito ata yung pinaka-recent na earthquake na naramdaman din dito sa Metro Manila. This is in Porac Church, Pampanga. Porac Church is one of the heritage churches in Pampanga who suffered greatly on the magnitude 6.1 earthquake that shook parts of Luzon last April 22, 2019. And ito naman, ito yung pinakamalayo siguro dito sa Metro Manila. This is the Santa Maria de Mayon Church in Itbayat, Batanes. This is what happened to the church after the Batanes Islands were hit by a magnitude 5.9 earthquake last July 27, 2019. So, after ko ipakita lahat ng pictures na yun, so can we all agree that lahat ng yon disasters, di ba? So, nag-a-agree tayo doon na disasters lahat yon. So, pero bago natin i-discuss yung kung ano ba talaga yung nangyari dito sa mga heritage churches na to or sa mga collections na nasisira during a disaster, i-define muna natin kung ano yung disaster. Well, a disaster based on United Nations International Strategy for Disaster Reduction. A disaster is a serious disruption of the functioning of a community or society involving widespread human, material, economic, or environmental losses and impacts, which exceeds the ability of the affected community or society to cope using its own resources. A time period of a disaster situation may range from a few hours to even months and sometimes years. It is difficult to determine the starting and ending point of a disaster. So, for example, during the Typhoon Yolanda entered during the Typhoon Yolanda entered the Philippine Area of Responsibility on November 8, 2013, then leaves the country the day after. But the damage it brought to the affected provinces were so devastating, and that the rescue and response operation took months or even a year ata. Tapos di ba ngayon until now may mga issues pa rin tungkol dun sa nangyari during the Typhoon Yolanda. So hindi definite kung kailan nangyayari, kung kailan nagsisimula at kailan natatapos yung disaster. And now, since we already have an idea or the definition of a disaster, our next question would be, paano nangyayari yung disaster? So what causes disaster? Paano ba siya nabubuo? Ano yung mga factors bago nangyayari yung disaster? A disaster can happen because of the following things. One, natural events. Second is human-induced events. Third is catastrophic agents. And last is yung slow and progressive agents of deterioration. So ano ba yung mga natural events na yan? It could be an earthquake, typhoons or cyclones, floods, forest fires, tsunami, and landslides. Ano naman yung mga human-induced events that causes a disaster? Pwedeng explosion, fire, chemical release or chemical explosion, pwede rin yung looting, vandalism, of course terrorism attacks, and also flooding. Next is ano naman yung mga catastrophic agents? Catastrophic agents that may cause a disaster. So pwedeng yung mga momentary natural geographical events such as earthquakes, volcanic eruptions, and landslides. Meteorological events such as cyclones, lightning, fire, drought, avalanches, and etc. Next naman is pwede yung catastrophic agents like oceanographic events, for example, tsunami. And I think kahapon, di ba nagkaroon ng tsunami warning pero buti na lang hindi umabot sa atin. And next is hydrological events, ito yung sa floods, and also biological events, epidemic, and also yung nangyayari sa atin yung pandemic. Next is technological events. This is like, for example, explosion, structural collapse, also yung release of toxic materials. Next is yung social and anthropogenic events like terrorism, political conflicts, war, etc. na nangyayari on some parts of our country. Now, I think ito naman is yung mga slow and progressive agents of deterioration. I think bukod, kasi kami sa Escuela talaga, we deal, madalas nagdi-deal kami sa built heritage, but I think this is also applicable to museum collection. So, one agent of deterioration is physical forces. The common sources of physical forces, for example, is incorrect handling, storage, transportation, collisions, wind erosion, excavations, constructions, earthquakes, traffic, overload, etc. The possible effect of physical forces could be collapse, deformation, breakage, abrasion, wearing and tearing, and etc. Ang example ko dito sa slide na to is on your left. This is a heritage house that was damaged because of the a strong wind brought by Typhoon Ompong last September 2018. And in the middle photo is the stone image of Our Lady of Remedies in Malate. For those of you na nakapunta na ng Malate, yung Malate Church kasi was facing Manila Bay. So, since nakaharap siya ng dagat, malakas yung hangin doon, and ito yung dahilan kung bakit nasira yung itong stone image of Our Lady of Remedies. Next is on your right is the Basilica de Santo Niño Cebu. So nasira yung uppermost portion ng bell tower niya. Also during the Bohol earthquake on last 2013. Next agent of deterioration is criminal or thieves and vandals. So the possible sources would be political, ideological, economic, or personal motivations. Ang effect nito sa ating heritage assets is disappearance, of course, destruction, disfiguration, and etc. And I think the best example for this is itong nangyari sa San Joaquin Camposanto, Iloilo. So nagkaroon ng treasure hunting doon. And ang pinaka nakakalungkot na kwento dito sa treasure hunting sa San Joaquin Camposanto is that allegedly yung parish priest ng Camposanto, yung mastermind pa nung treasure hunting. So, nakakalungkot. Next agent of deterioration is, of course, fire. The possible sources could be lightning, forest fires, gas leaks, fireworks, faulty electrical installations or equipment, of course, smoking, candles sa mga churches, arson, construction and renovation works, and etc. Of course, the possible effect could be a total or partial burning, collapse or deformation by heating, soot deposition, etc. So, ang example na nilagay ko dito is yun nga, inasunog yung mga heritage houses sa Buwak, Marinduque. Next agent of deterioration is water. The possible sources could be tsunami, flooded rivers, of course yung ulan, lalo ngayon, maulan na, groundwater, dissolution, corrosion, weathering, salt efflorescence, of course yung biological growth, etc. So ito yung example dito is ito yung masonry, brick masonry sa San Pablo Cathedral. Yung sa kaliwa, this is the brick masonry of San Pablo Cathedral, and on the right is the stone carvings on the facade of Malate Church. Because of their long, exposure to the elements, especially the rainwater, the adobe and bricks are severely deteriorated that when you touch those stones, powdery na siya and crumbling na. So, ganun kalala yung effect ng water sa kanila. So, next agent of deterioration is, of course, pests and vegetation. The possible sources would be the local fauna, yung mga insects, mga daga, ibon, pati mga panike. And the possible effect, of course, staining, perforation, weakening, loss of some parts, and etc. On your left is ito yung termite infestation na nakita namin on one leg of the Ciliaria or choir stalls at the San Agustin Church in Intramuros. Yung middle photo is the plant growth on the belfry of San Pablo Cathedral, Laguna. And on your right is the plant growth on the buttress of Mga Tarim Church in Pangasinan. So, nagkakaroon na ng forest, and kami on conservation heritage, we always tell tell people na stop romanticizing those vegetations na nakikita nyo sa simbahan na akala nyo cute, akala nyo maganda dahil mukhang luma, pero hindi nyo na-realize that those plants are actually putting these heritage churches or at risk or further deterioration. And later on, nakakatakot na lalo na to sa bell tower na dahil sa sobrang dami yan ng halaman, sobrang hina ng structure, anytime pwedeng mahulog yan, yung malaking bato na yan sa mga parishioners. So hindi maganda yung halaman sa mga heritage churches. And of course sa collections din, hindi rin maganda na tutubuan na lang kunyari painting yun ng halaman. Hindi yun okay. Next agent of deterioration is pollutants. The possible sources could be industries, vehicles, construction and renovation works, storage and display materials that emit gases, pwede din yung mga visitors sa museum or sa simbahan, restoration materials that contaminate the object, and etc. The possible effect on our heritage assets could be weakening, yung nagkakaroon din ng staining, nangingitim siya o darkening, erosion, corrosion, etc. So, on your left, that is yung carbon deposits na present sa isang wall sa Paco Park Ossuary. And then your right is yung main facade ng Malate Church na nangingitim na kasi yung Paco Park and Malate are both in Manila and they are surrounded by roads. So yung mga usok galing sa sasakyan na pupunta, kumakapit dun sa mga bato and later on nasisira sila. Next agent of deterioration is light and UV. So the sources of course is sun, electric light sources like yung mga lamps or mga ilaw na nilalagay natin sa collections natin or sa loob ng simbahan. The possible effects could be color fading. That is the primary effect of light. Yellowing, weakening, and disintegration. Yun yung mga primary effects naman ng UV. Next agent of deterioration is incorrect temperature. It's either too high, too low, or nagkakaroon ng matinding fluctuations. Possible sources could be yung local climate. Nagkakaroon ng local climate sa isang room or sa isang gallery. Tapos pwede rin galing sa sunlight, pwede rin incandescent lamps or heaters, etc. Possible effects on our heritage assets could be, nagkakaroon ng faster deterioration by chemical reactions, nagkakaroon ng deformation, pwede rin nagkaroon ng dehydration, embrittlement, softening, etc. So ito on your left, this is in Minalin. This is a niche in Minalin Retablo. When we are doing the conservation works in the Retablo of Minalin Church in Pampanga, this is one of the problems na identify namin because of incorrect temperature. The wood used to construct this niche of the retablo, sobrang naging malutong na siya na kapag hinahawakan mo siya, nasisira na siya agad. On the middle is a paper para do sa mga para do sa mga museum or sa mga archives, di ba? Pag incorrect temperature, lalo na kung lumang documents, lumulutong pati yung papel, and of course pati rin sa film, ito yung film negative on your right. Next agent of deterioration, of course, is incorrect relative humidity. Again, it's either too high, too low, or meron din matinding fluctuation. So, possible sources niya is, again, local climate, pwede rin groundwater, yung tubig galing sa lupa, inadequate air conditioning, nagkakaroon din ng microclimates, and etc. Ang possible effect niya sa ating heritage assets would be deformation, cracking, flaking, delamination, weakening, corrosion, mold growth, staining, etc. So, itong tatlong photos ito, these photos are all taken when we are doing the conservation of the retablo at the Minalin Church in Pampanga. On the left is an old painting of La Consolacion. Because of incorrect relative humidity, you can see that the paint is started peeling off, natatanggal na yung paint dun sa wood. On the middle is one of the major components of the retablo kasi para para magawa namin siya ng maayos, para ma-conserve namin siya ng maayos, yung retablo, we have to dismantle it. And upon dismantling, itong component na to, na bubulok na siya, kasi siya yung pinaka-base ng retablo eh. So siya yung pinaka-malapit dun sa groundwater. And ito na yung naabutan namin doon, nasisira na, nabubulok na yung component, wooden component na to. And on the right is also one of the niches ng retablo, where the wooden components were, sobrang lutong na ulit, na pag hinawakan mo siya, nasisira na siya. Para na siyang, pag hinawakan mo siya, bigla na siyang parang pumuputok dahil sobrang lutong na niya. Last agent of deterioration is, of course, dissociation. Yung common sources ito is, of course, lack of inventory, poor documentation or identification, misplacing objects, hardware and software obsolescence, staff retirement. For example, nag-retire isang staff ng museum, hindi maayos yung turnover niya, so nagkakaroon ng dissociation. And yung effect nito is loss of information about heritage assets, yung pwede rin temporary loss or nawawala na talaga siya, or inability to access heritage items. I think this is one of the common problems of most the museums or heritage buildings. Halimbawa, sa simbahan, they don't have a complete or proper documentation ng church nila. And same thing sa museum, wala silang updated inventory ng collections nila. So kapag yung collection nila nawala, hindi na nila alam kung saan hahanapin because they don't have complete documentation. So pag nawala yung collection, hindi na nahanap, wala na, habang buhay na siyang mawawala. So napaka-importante ng documentation and inventory. So the things that I've mentioned earlier, yung natural events, human-induced events, catastrophic agents, slow and progressive agents of deterioration, they're all external sources of risk or disaster risk agents or sources. And these external sources of risks are called hazard. And by definition, hazard is a phenomenon, substance, activity, or condition that is considered dangerous and which may cause loss of life, injury, or other health impact, property damage, loss of livelihoods and services, social and economic disruptions, or environmental damage. Now, ang tanong, are these hazards enough to make a disaster? The answer is no. So the next question is, what turns these events or agents into a disaster? So before I answer that question, or before we answer that question, I want you to look on this slide. So I think karamihan sa atin alam yung 4 picks, 1 word. So since hindi ko alam kung alam niyo yun, sulat nyo sa chat. Pero since hindi ko nababasa yung chat, so anyway, itong 4 na picture na to, this is the White Church in Bohol. Itong upper left. Itong upper right, this is in Porac Church in Pampanga. Ito namang nasa lower left, this is the vegan heritage houses in Vigan after the Typhoon Ompong. And ito namang nasa lower right is yung mga bahay or infrastructure after the Typhoon Yolanda. So ano yung common denominator nitong 4 na to? Again, kung isagot nyo lang dyan sa chat, babasahin namin yung mamaya. So we can assume that maybe because yung mga simbahan, luma na siyang structure, and because yung mga bahay siguro mahina na siya, we maybe because of also sa past interventions na ginawa sa simbahan, their structural integrity is compromised, and hence they are severely damaged during the earthquake and the typhoon. Or maybe because maybe wala rin hindi rin properly maintained yung mga churches na to o yung mga bahay na to. And because of these circumstances, I think it's safe to assume that all itong isa sa mga common denominator ng 4 na picture na to, they are all physically vulnerable. So ano pa? Ano pa yung pagkakatulad-tulad nilang 4? Can we also say that because this is all, lahat ng incident na to o lahat ng disaster na to nangyari sa Pilipinas, And because the Philippines is earthquake and typhoon-prone country, pwede ba natin sabihin na dahil doon kaya nasira itong mga structures na to or itong old churches, itong mga bahay na to? Yes, we can say that. So it's also safe to say that they are all exposed to earthquake and typhoon because of their geographical location. So these factors, the exposure due to location, micro and micro level, sensitivity of material and construction due to inherent weakness or past interventions or transformations, ineffectiveness or lack of management, walang maintenance and monitoring. These factors mentioned can all be classified as physical vulnerability. But besides physical vulnerability, there are other types of vulnerability. But first, let's see the definition of vulnerability. Based on UNIDSR, vulnerability is the characteristics and circumstances of a community, system, or asset that make it susceptible to damaging effects of a hazard. So ano-ano ba yung iba't ibang uri ng vulnerability? So it could be physical, social, economic, institutional, or attitudinal. So physical vulnerability. The physical vulnerability of an area also depends on its geographic proximity to the source and origin of the disasters. If an area lies near the coastlines, fault lines, unstable hills, etc., it makes the area more vulnerable to disasters as compared to an area that is far away from the origin of the disasters. Physical vulnerability includes the difficulty in access to water resources, means of communications, hospital, police stations, fire brigades, roads, bridges, and exits of a building or an area in case of disaster. So, besides the structure itself or kung paano yung roofing system ng isang building or ng structural system ng isang building or yung material condition ng isang museum collection, we also need to know if there are existing supporting infrastructure if nearby if a disaster happens. Like for example, nung Typhoon Haiyan, na-destroyed, yung Typhoon Haiyan or Typhoon Yolanda, nasira yung airport niya. Nasira yung airport sa Leyte at dahil doon, yung rescue and response sa mga biktima ng typhoon na delay. Also, I think yung sa Bureau of Fire, since hindi tayo handa rin, hindi tayo handa kapag may susunod na sunog na katulad nung, or pag may katulad na incident ng Beirut explosion, hindi handa rin yung Bureau of Fire natin. Yung hospitals natin during disasters, how ready they are. Also yung infrastructures, yung bridges, yung roads, kaya ba nilang withstand yung, say, yung lindol or yung isang disaster. And also, since the Philippines is an archipelago, we are very physically vulnerable as most areas or provinces do not have the support infrastructure and are really hard to reach. Like for example, nung Batanes, nung lumindol sa kanila, kailangan pang mag-helicopter or kailangan pang bumiyahe ng pagkalayo-layo para lang matulungan yung mga tao nandun. So, yun, physically, napakataas ng physical vulnerability ng Pilipinas. Next type of vulnerability is social vulnerability. A socially vulnerable community has weak family structures, lack of leadership for decision-making and conflict resolution, meron ding unequal participation in decision-making, mayroong weak or no community organizations, and the one in which people are discriminated based on their racial, ethnic, linguistic, or religious beliefs. Other social factors such as culture, tradition, religion, local norms and values, economic standard, and political accountability also play a vital role determining the social vulnerability of a community. So we should look if there are strong community participation on decision making. Kasi halimbawa, merong conservation ng simbahan, ng lumang simbahan ng community. Titignan natin kung meron bang participation, kung strong ba yung participation ng community para doon sa conservation And also, we should look if those who are in the position, especially yung mga nasa LGU, if they are consulting their constituents. And of course, if the constituents also support the good initiatives of the LGUs. Social vulnerability to natural phenomena is greatest among the poorest people in developing countries, owing to a lack of information and resources with which to take the appropriate measures. Within this group, children, women, and the elderly are considered to be the most vulnerable. Next is economic vulnerability. Economic vulnerability of a community can be assessed by determining how varied its sources of income, the ease of access and control over means of production, like farmland, livestock, irrigation, capital, etc., adequacy of economic fallback mechanisms, and the availability of natural resources in the area. I think itong economic vulnerability, this is very evident now. Halimbawa, yung sa COVID-19 vaccines, countries who have the resources can afford million of doses of COVID vaccines. Unlike, halimbawa sa Filipinas or other countries, yung mga developing countries, they can only afford a few doses. It's also about coping capacities after the disaster. Meron bang sapat na resources tayo to answer the needs of the people. Halimbawa, meron ba tayong enough na clean water, meron ba tayong pabahay, or meron ba tayong clothing, mga basic needs. Kaya ba natin i-provide yun after a disaster? Next is institutional vulnerability. Institutional vulnerability to disaster risk is defined here as both the context and the process by which formal institutions like regulations, rule of law, constitutions, codes, bureaucracy, etc., and informal institutions, culture, norms, traditions, etc., and governance are either too weak to provide protection against disaster risk or are ignorant of their duty to provide safety and human security. Central to this argument is the concept that institutions are designed, among others, to reduce risks. So institutional vulnerability should answer question, for example, is the DRM implemented properly? Are there any LGU undertakings, plans, and laws and policies in place? Also, of course, yung politika. So halimbawa, ngayon pinaka-common yung sa ayuda daw, di ba? Yung napupolitika, pati yung pagbibigay ng tulong doon sa mga nangangailangan. So, merong institutional vulnerability na involved sa ganun. Next is attitudinal vulnerability, a community which has negative attitude towards change and lacks initiative in life resultantly become more and more dependent on external support. They cannot act independently. Their sources of livelihood do not have variety, lacks entrepreneurship, and do not possess the concept of collectivism. This brings out disunity and individualism in the society. Thus, they become victims of complex hopelessness and pessimism, which reduces their capacity of coping with the disaster. I think ito sa eskwela talaga, ito yung pinaka-common na isa sa mga pinaka-common na hinaharap namin problema, yung complacency. Working in Escuela Atelier and in the field of heritage conservation, complacency is what we encountered almost every time. Yung mga parishioners or even the parish, they are saying that, yung Diyos daw, hindi hahayaan na masira yung simbahan nila, na hindi daw yun papayagan ni Lord na masira yung sambahan niya, yung bahay niya. Pero, nasisira talaga siya kasi may mga churches na nasisira ng lindol. And also, yung mga tao na nagsasabi na, huwag na natin i-conserve yan, huwag na natin daw i-conserve because tumayo naman daw ng 300 years, tumayo naman daw yung simbahan ng ilang daan taon pero hindi nasira. Pero gising, may mga ilang simbahan na rin na ilang daan taon na rin nakatayo pero nasira pa rin. So yung complacent sila na masyado na hindi na sila kikilos dahil hindi naman daw nasisira, dahil hindi naman daw pababayaan ni Lord. Pero 'di ba, nasa Diyos ang awa, pero nasa tao ang gawa nga. Now let's talk about vulnerability due to exposure. By definition, exposure is the situation of people, infrastructure, housing, production capacities, and other tangible human assets located in hazard-prone areas. So, yung mga question na sinasagot sa exposure is what elements is exposed. It could be building components, building fabric, etc. Who is exposed? It could be the community, the parishioners, the building users, museum staff, or yung mga bisita sa museum. Why is it exposed? Dahil ba sa geographical location? Meron din bang dahil ba sa lack of conservation efforts? Dahil ba mahina yung material ng collection natin? Or dahil ba meron tayong poor building maintenance program? Now, going back to this picture once again, bakit ito nangyari? So, isa-isayin natin yung causes niya. May earthquake, may typhoon, so merong hazards. Tama, di ba? Next is yung building, pwedeng because they are old, pwede ring walang proper maintenance. So, and also, pwede ring gawa siya sa mahinang materyales. So, they are physically vulnerable. So, meron ng hazards, meron pang physical vulnerability. Next, since we are in the Philippines, napaka-common na ng earthquake and typhoon sa atin. So, dahil nasa Pilipinas tayo, we are exposed due to our geographical locations. And therefore, we conclude that disasters result from a complex interaction of multiple hazards, exposure, and vulnerability. So, hindi pwedeng mangyaring disaster nung walang hazard, exposure, and vulnerability. Kailangan nag-interact itong tatlong ito. So, kung gagawa natin siya ng equation or kung titignan natin siya sa ganito, ang hazards, it could be natural events such as floods. Yun nga, natural events, man-made events, or agents of deterioration. Plus exposure and vulnerability. Pwede rin lack of improper or management systems. Meron ding structurally exposed siya. Pwede rin mahina yung materials. And of course, yung vulnerability like social, economic, institutional, and attitudinal. So, while the literature and common usage often mistakenly combine exposure and vulnerability, distinct sila sa isa't isa. So exposure is necessary but not sufficient determinant of disaster risk. So possible na exposed ka pero hindi ka vulnerable. Halimbawa, nakatira ka sa isang isang lugar na bahain. Pero kunyari, dahil magaling yung arkitekto mo, alam niya na nakatira ka sa bahain na lugar, sinuggest niya sa'yo na itaas natin tong bahay mo, i-raise natin siya sa ground para hindi ka abutan ng baha. So exposed ka, but because of that intervention, na nilagay yung bahay mo on stilts, tinaas siya sa ground, nabawasan yung vulnerability mo. However, to be vulnerable to an extreme event, it is necessary to also be exposed. So yun nga, it's difficult to determine the starting and ending point of a disaster. So again, if we put it in the equation, disaster risk is equal to hazard plus exposure plus vulnerability over capacities. Because again, if you have the capacities to prevent or do something about your vulnerabilities and exposure, a disaster might not happen, or a disaster might have a lower impact to the people or to the heritage assets. Now, with that being said, hazards, exposure, vulnerabilities, along with their capacities, they should all be present for a disaster to happen, and therefore, keep calm and repeat after me. Disasters are not natural. So, hindi totoo. So, ano lang yun? Gawa-gawa lang. Or, tanggalin na natin yung konsepto ng natural disasters. Hindi siya totoo. Walang natural disaster. It could be disaster due to natural hazards or disaster due to human-induced hazards but never nagkaroon ng natural disaster. Ito yung sinasabi nila na earthquakes do not kill or injure people. Yung mga building daw ang pumapatay ng tao, mga building na hindi maayos ang design or mahiling pagkakagawa. So yung disaster, hindi lang siya kasalanan ng earthquake at hindi lang din siya kasalanan ng bagyo. So technically, pati tayong mga tao, kasama tayo sa problema kung bakit nangyayari yung disaster. Ngayon, ano ba yung kami sa Escuela Taller, ano ba yung ginagawa namin para at least makatulong, ma-prevent yung mga ganitong disaster? What EEFFI has been doing. And before ko sabihin sa inyo kung ano ba yung ginagawa namin sa Escuela Taller, papakilala ko muna kung sino o ano ba si Escuela Taller. Escuela Taller is a program that was made possible by a grant from the government of Spain and a corresponding Philippine counterpart fund through the National Commission for Culture and the Arts. The Escuela Taller of Intramuros is the first endeavor of this sort that the Agencia Española de Cooperación Internacional para el Desarrollo, or ACID, had embarked on in Asia, the Philippines having strong ties with Spain through its shared history. So nagsimula po ang Escuela Taller sa partnership ni ACID and ni NCCA. Now, the threefold objective of Escuela Taller has to do with these basic key areas: skill development, heritage conservation, and advocacy. Now, sa skills development, Escuela Taller trains out-of-school youth in modern and traditional masonry, carpentry, woodworking, painting, and related skills needed for the conservation and adaptive use of Philippine tangible heritage. So tinitrain po namin yung mga out-of-school youth from marginalized areas ng isang buong taon dito sa Escuela Taller Intramuros and in Bohol. So through the establishment of satellite training also, satellite training programs outside Metro Manila and Bohol, we were able to increase yung capacity building ng pagtitrain ng mga out-of-school youth. Next is heritage conservation. Escuela Taller contributes to the proper conservation of Philippine tangible heritage through its involvement in conserving various building types that belong to the different periods of Philippine history. These projects are opportunities for the learning by doing activities of trainees who are deployed to said project. So dinideploy po namin yung mga trainees namin doon sa mga project na to. At the same time, these projects are employment opportunities for our graduates who act as the core workforce that mentors and supervises trainees. So yung mga graduate naman namin, itong mga learning by doing projects na to, nagiging opportunity naman to para sa kanila, para magkatrabaho, and at the same time, para matrain and para maging mentor ng mga current trainees namin. And also, to ensure that these projects are implemented in accordance with international standards and principles of architectural heritage conservation, Escuela Taller offers technical assistance to project proponents in managing the conservation and the development of heritage structures and sites. Now, in our advocacy, Escuela Taller helps raise the awareness of the general public about the importance of capacity building among the Filipino youth and how the proper conservation of Philippine tangible heritage contributes to socio-economic development through the organization of dissemination activities such as international and local conferences, exhibits, capacity building seminar and workshops, learning by doing projects and research programs related to heritage conservation. Kami sa Escuela Taller, we help bridge the gap between the theory and practice in order to, further develop the industry of heritage conservation in the country. Now, these are some of Escuela Taller's project. So, sa upper row, sa kaliwa, that is the Malate Church that is the Malate Church. Sa gitna naman, that is the San Pablo Cathedral in Laguna. And yung kaliwa naman, ito yung Holy Rosary Parish in Angeles, Pampanga. Doon naman sa lower row, itong nasa kaliwa, that is the choir stalls or Ciliarias ng San Agustin Church Choir Loft. Yung nasa gitna, ito yung ginawa namin sa Paco Park. This is the Paco Park Ossuary. We conserve the walls. And itong nasa kaliwa, that is in Apalit, that is Apalit Church in Pampanga. Now, lahat ng project na to, they all have, again, common denominator. Yung San Pablo called our help because, nangyari yung Bohol earthquake and they are afraid na baka mangyari din sa simbahan nila yung nangyari sa Bohol earthquake. So, tinawag nila kami para ayusin yung facade and yung bell tower nung San Pablo Cathedral. Sa Malate naman and Apalit Church, nagkaroon kasi nagkaroon ng incident na may nalaglag na small fraction dun sa ceiling nila. So, they called the help of Escuela Talier and later on, naging project din siya ng Escuela Talier. As for the Holy Rosary Parish Church in Angeles, Pampanga, the conservation of the church was pushed through because the church also shows significant damages after the Luzon earthquake. So isa rin siya doon sa naapektuhan ng Luzon earthquake. So all of these heritage assets, what Escuela Talier did is actually a preventive conservation. Now, what is preventive conservation? Preventive conservation is the mitigation of deterioration and damage to cultural property, thus avoiding major restoration interventions. Preventive conservation is an ongoing process that continues throughout the life of cultural property and does not end with interventive treatment. So ngayon, tatanungin nyo, you would probably ask, I thought preventive conservation is done to avoid major restoration interventions. But ang ginagawa ng Escuela Talier naman, major interventions na. Yes, it is true that what we are doing is major interventions already. But this is because, kung babalikan niyo yung definition ng preventive conservation, it is an ongoing process that continues throughout the life of cultural property. And nangyayari kasi, these heritage assets do not undergo preventive conservation or do not undergo proper preventive conservation ever since. And therefore, it is already in worst state that minor interventions or minor intervention works is not an option anymore. And because of our advocacy to help the custodians of these heritage assets, we developed a preventive conservation manual for adobe masonry in the Philippines. This is the first of excuse me, preventive conservation program series, and we are hoping that we could do more manuals for other materials, say bricks, wood, core stones, etc. Also, with the help of Prince Claus Funds in Netherlands, we are currently enhancing this manual to a multimedia tool or multimedia learning tool to achieve a wider range of audience. And we are considering to actually translate it to different languages here in the country. We are also developing a curriculum based on this manual to train more skilled workers to help us in the protection of our built heritage churches. Also by these, we wish to inspire other institutions to also partner with us or to also develop their own manual. For example, yung sana sa manual na to, we inspire for example, yung isang museum na gumawa rin sila ng same manual or mag-develop din sila ng isang programa para makapag-train pa ng ibang tao or pwede rin mag-develop ng manual para maiayos pa yung mga museum collections nila. Again, with this, we just wanted to clear that the preventive conservation is just one aspect of disaster risk reduction and management for cultural heritage. Maliit na portion lang po ang preventive conservation ng DRRM for cultural heritage. So ngayon itatanong nyo, ano ba yung DRRM na yan? Diba? Why disaster risk management plan? Disaster risk reduction and management is the application of disaster risk reduction policies and strategies to prevent new disaster risk, reduce existing disaster risk, and manage residual risk, contributing to the strengthening of resilience and reduction of disaster losses. Disaster risk management implies not only for emergency response, but also for proactive planning for reducing risk and long-term recovery after the disaster. Sa case sa Pilipinas or sa case nating lahat, di ba, madalas ang nangyayari, we are reactive rather than proactive. So, yung disaster risk management, nakakatulong siya na maging proactive tayo sa mga disaster na nangyayari sa atin. Post-disaster recovery should also contribute towards risk reduction to future disasters. More than just giving, response and rescue operations, we should always take the opportunity to integrate, whenever possible, to integrate systems that would contribute to the reduction of risk of future disasters. It is also important to establish interlinkages between various stages of disaster risk management, like prevention and mitigation, emergency preparedness and response, and recovery. Now that we are mentioning risks, you're probably asking, what is risk? So what is risk, you ask? Risk is everywhere, diba? Lahat, nakapalibot sa ating risk. But by definition, risks in emergency situations are essentially the potential negative impacts on people's lives, heritage components, and associated values. So, kaya ba natin i-prevent yung disaster risk? Or kaya ba natin i-prevent yung risk to happen? Of course, we can. So, paano? How? What we can do to prevent the risk? First that we can do to prevent the risk is we can try to understand the disaster risk that threaten us. We should be aware with our context. Dapat alam natin kung ano yung konteksto natin. The hazards, dapat alam din natin yung hazards that might threaten us, our vulnerabilities and our exposures, and also the capacities already integrated within our community or our institutions. Next that we can do is we can try to reduce those risks that we have identified. And then, pag na-identify na natin yung risks, we can then be prepared to respond. And once you have substantial information about the possible risk you are facing, you can now propose the integration of systems or policies that will enable you to respond sa disaster risk. Next is we need to move from managing disasters to managing disaster risks. Why? Because disasters can happen anytime, anywhere, and it is inevitable. But once we learn how to rather manage the risk of a disaster, then we can have a fair chance of preventing the disaster risks of a disaster. But how we can learn to manage the risk of a disaster? We need to have a disaster risk management plan. And what does a DRM plan look like? One is you have to have a definite scope. So the question you should answer is, what are the scopes of your DRM plan? Is it in your museums only? Or is it specific only to a building or to a gallery or to a room, or specific lang ba siya sa storage area ng collections nyo or storage room ng collections nyo? Or are you considering developing a DRM plan to a whole community say a heritage district. Next is understand your risk, existing and new risks. Again, know your context, study your hazard maps, consult with the experts in like FIVOX, Pag-asa, your local firemen, local police. Know your vulnerabilities and your exposure. List down all capacities that you have in place. Next is write down activities to reduce those risks with timelines. Create a worst case scenario. Be pessimistic as much as possible. Say what will happen to your collection if a disaster happens in the next year because of an earthquake or a typhoon. Within the scenario, the interaction of hazards, vulnerabilities, and exposure should be clear. And also, this scenario is a it's very important as you can use this to have a preview of activities which you will act upon to reduce the impact of disaster risk. Fourth, make financial and administrative provisions to support such activities. You should make a breakdown of costs of the activities you need to implement based on the scenario you created. Provide a list of all administrative help that you need to implement uh, for the said activities. Fifth is implement. No, so meron ka ng activities, implement those activities. Six is to spread awareness and communicate those risks to all. Gather all stakeholders, actors, and stakeholders that you can invite, like museum staff and administrator, pwede rin local police, local firemen, the barangay captain, the mayor, people from Pag-asa, FIVOX, etc. Present them the scenario you have made and let them realize the possible impact of the disaster risk. Present them your action plans with timeline and also ask for their help, be it be financial or in kind. Seventh is build your capacity to respond. Have an emergency action plans. So what will be your emergency plan? So when is the time you will evacuate your collections? Will you build a partnership with other institutions that can help you with the evacuation of your collections? So those are things you should answer on this step. You should also train your staff on how to respond during an emergency. Arrange drills with the local fire and police, and conduct workshops and trainings with the community so that they can help your institution when an emergency happen. Masabi ko sa inyo, malaki yung tulong ng community sa mga disaster. Kasi since sila yung nandun malapit, halimbawa sa simbahan, or malapit sa museum collection, or sa museum nyo, yung community na malapit sa inyo could actually help you kapag nagkakaroon ng disaster sa community or sa lugar nyo. Last is build your capacity to build back better. So you should be consistent. You continue the drills, continue giving workshops, you update your DRM plan, and continue seeking support. So, nabanggit yung build back better. Ano ba yung build back better na yan? So, this is the disaster risk management cycle. And the build back better is the integration of disaster risk reduction measures into the restoration of physical infrastructure and societal systems and into the revitalization of livelihoods, economies, and the environment. So, titignan mo tong, when you look at this disaster risk management cycle, but you can see on the lower pie, preparation, response, prevention and mitigation, rehabilitation, and recovery are all divided equally. But because of Build Back Better and by integration of the concept of Build Back Better, we are hoping that prevention dito sa upper pie, that prevention and mitigation would be the utmost priority in our DRM. Because, as cliche as it is, prevention is always better than cure. Now, ngayon nakikita natin yung paano ba yung disaster risk management cycle or disaster risk management plan. Now, let's talk about the disaster risk reduction and management in the context of the Philippines. But before that, let me just give you a brief context of our country when it comes to hazards. Due to its geographical location, the Philippines is very vulnerable to natural hazards. The Philippines is located in the Pacific Ring of Fire. So for those of mga tao or sa mga participants na hindi nakakaalam kung ano yung Pacific Ring of Fire, the Pacific Ring of Fire is the path along the Pacific Ocean characterized by active volcanoes and frequent earthquakes. 75% of Earth's volcanoes or more than 450 volcanoes are located along the Pacific Ring of Fire. And 90% of Earth's earthquakes occur along this path, including the planet's most violent and dramatic seismic events. So, ayan ang Pilipinas. So, according to FIVOX, the Philippines is experiencing 20 earthquakes per day, but most of them are too weak to be felt. Technically, every part of the Philippines or every part of the country is exposed to earthquakes-related hazards due to numerous active faults and trenches across the archipelago. This slide is this slide is showing the historical typhoon cyclone tracks in the Western Pacific where the Philippines is located. So, makikita nyo sa mapa na to, like streamers of splattered paint, the tracks of nearly 150 years of tropical cyclones were weaved across the globe in this map. The map is based on all storm tracks available from the National Hurricane Center and the Joint Typhoon Warning Center. So the accumulation of tracks reveals several details of hurricane climatology, such as where the most severe storms form and the large-scale atmospheric patterns that influence the track of hurricanes. Now, ayan ang Pilipinas. And you can see the Philippines anymore on this map. And we are almost experiencing intensity 4 to 5 typhoons for 150 years. Now imagine, kapag nagsabay yung lindol at bagyo. So nangyari na siya noong nakaraang Friday lang ata, di ba? While yung umuulan na malakas, nagkaroon ng lindol na naramdaman dito sa Manila. And also nangyari na rin siya almost sabay nung after the Bohol earthquake. Almost a month after dumating naman ng Typhoon Yolanda. So yung Bohol most especially is talagang sobrang devastated ng 2013 dahil one, na ano na nga siya, na naapektuhan na nga siya ng lindol. Pangalawa, dahil dun sa Visayas region tumama yung Yolanda. So naapektuhan na siya ng Typhoon Yolanda. So imagine kung gaano ka devastated yung mga tao nandoon nung 2013. So nakakatakot na sana sa ngayon na maulan, hindi na ulit sumabay pa yung lindol, and hopefully sana talaga hindi mangyari siya. Of course, also our country is experiencing conflicts on some areas kagaya ng nangyari sa Marawi Siege. Lalo na dun sa part sa Mindanao, may mga conflicts and na nangyayari pa rin doon. Because of all these hazards, actually, the vulnerabilities and exposure, the Philippines ranked 9th out of 180 countries in World Risk Index 2020. Also based on Informed Country Risk 2021, out of 191 countries, the Philippines ranked 33rd tayo sa 191 countries. Inform is a global, objective, and transparent tool for understanding the risk of humanitarian crisis. Inform is a composite indicator developed by the Joint Research Center, combining 53 indicators into 3 dimensions of risk. hazards, exposure, and vulnerability, and lack of coping capacity. Yung inform, nagbibigay siya sa bawat bansa ng risk score of 1 to 10, 1 being the lowest and 10 the highest for each of the dimensions, categories, and components of risk, as well as an overall risk score. The higher the score, of course, the more vulnerable a country is. And I don't know if it's a good thing or a bad thing, but our ranking for the last 3 years dito sa Inform, steady lang siya. So I think it's a good thing that we are not ranking higher, but also a bad thing maybe because wala tayong ginagawa or kulang pa yung ginagawa natin para ma-improve yung DRM and ma-improve yung capacities natin to manage disaster risks. Now, ito na yung DRRM in the Philippines. So, the guiding policy of the DRRM in the Philippines is, of course, the Philippine Disaster Risk Reduction and Management Act, or RA 10121. RA 10121 is the peak policy-making body for coordination, integration, supervision, and monitoring and evaluation. Based on its IRR, yung RA 10121 lists the powers and functions of the national, regional, and local disaster risk reduction and management councils, or DRRMCs, as well as provisions for installing local disaster risk reduction and management office, or LDRRMOs, in every barangay. The guiding framework of the DRRM in the Philippines is the National Disaster Risk Reduction and Management Framework of 2011. It explains the country's commitments into priority programs, projects, and budgets, and is integrated into the Philippine National Disaster Risk Reduction Plan. So yung National Disaster Risk Reduction and Management Plan, or NDRRMP, outlines key planning aspects such as timelines, lead agencies, outcomes, and activities according to 4 thematic areas. Ito yung mga 4 thematic areas natin. Prevention and mitigation, preparedness, disaster preparedness, disaster response, and disaster recovery and rehabilitation. The NDRRMP fulfills the requirement of RA 10121, which provides the legal basis for policies, plans, and programs to deal with disasters. The NDRRP also outlines provisions for developing and implementing disaster risk reduction plans at the regional, provincial, city, municipal, and barangay level. So, pag may tanong kayo mamaya, I think may mga invited speakers tayo later na galing dito sa mga agencies na to. Next is this is the DRRM functional structure in the Philippines. So of course, the president is overseeing the whole organization, but the Secretary of Department of National Defense is the chairperson of NDRRMC. Excuse me. And under him are the vice chairs of preparedness, response, vice chair for mitigation, and vice chair for rehabilitation. Also under the chairperson of NDRRMC is the secretariat, which is headed by the administrator of the civil defense, or the administrator of the Office of the Civil Defense. And under him is the regional DRRMC and local DRRMC, such as the provincial, city, municipal DRRMC. Now, if you have the time to read the whole DRRM plan or framework of our country, the protection of cultural heritage is not even mentioned on those documents. I think not a single word. Not a single word I mean. And we understand that kasi ano ba ang priority ng agency nito, the protection of the lives of our countrymen is the most important thing to do when a disaster happens. So hindi natin mapipilit na ang priority nila is saving the lives of the people. Totoo naman yon. But again, that doesn't mean that we need, pero hindi ibig sabihin nun kailangan natin tumigil na convincein sila to include the protection of cultural heritage in DRM plan of the country. That is why we at Escuela think and believe that by targeting the local community, hopefully the government will acknowledge our efforts in saving heritage assets, and eventually they will realize the importance of including the cultural heritage in the NDRRM plan or framework of the country. We at Escuela Atelier, as I have mentioned earlier, are helping the economically challenged youth by giving them training in the conservation of our heritage assets. We have successfully trained youths from Bohol, Apali, Pampanga, and also even in Batanes. We believe that by continuous training of the youth in the field of heritage conservation, we are not just saving the tangible side of heritage, but also the intangibles, which is the traditional skills that are not being practiced by many anymore. Also, we have forged partnerships with local organizations and institutions such as the ACCH, or the Archdiocesan Committee on Church Heritage in Pampanga, and Escuela Atelier helped them in conducting post-earthquake assessments after the Luzon earthquake. So hopefully in this webinar, we can also, partner with you, or can partner with us also. Escuela Atelier also conducted several seminars and workshops like this one, where we let the participants experience how to conserve our heritage asset like the walls of Paco Park. Now, since most of the participants from this webinar is from the museum, so I hope we can have a partnership na turuan nyo naman kami na on how to save or on how to conserve yung museum collections naman. We also conducted local and international symposia for the past years. And we also produced materials that can be used by the community and is helpful to the protection of heritage assets. Again, we are doing this. We are doing all these works in the hope that various government agencies, public or private institutions, would acknowledge yung efforts namin in saving our heritage assets. But now, our goal is to replicate these two programs with which I have the opportunity to attend and participate. One is the First Aid to Cultural Heritage in Time of Crisis. Ito yung training na pinuntahan ko last 2018 in Netherlands. And also yung FARCO Asia 2020, the Thinking Disaster Risk Management for Cultural Heritage Collections, na participant si Dr. Marian De Leon, and yung speaker natin mamaya si Dr. Carlos Tatel. And isa ako sa mentor nitong program na to. The overall goal of these programs is to create a network of proactive cultural first aiders whose role is to protect cultural heritage during a complex or major emergency, with an aim to promote recovery, peace, and risk reduction. So hopefully, when all is well and when the support came in, and especially with the help of various government institutions and agencies, especially those in PRRM, we can have the same training here in the Philippines, and the same training that is context specific in the Philippines. Because why? Why do we need to do the same program, or why do we have to support the protection of our cultural heritage assets, or why do we have to develop our DRF plans? Because again, we don't want this to happen again. Ayaw na natin itong mangyari, di ba? Ako kasi ayaw ko na. So, I think kailangan natin ng mga ganong program, like yung pag-train sa mga museum workers or those who are working in heritage conservation, matrain sila kung paano ba poprotektuhan yung ating heritage assets during a disaster. Kasi nakakalungkot na nawawala sila sa isang iglap dahil lang hindi natin sila naprotektahan during a disaster. Now, just a few slides before my presentation ends. I would like you to imagine your museum and your collection. So, imagine na merong leakage in your museum's rooftop because of an overhead tank na may leakage doon. And dahil hindi kayo nag-invest sa maintenance or hindi kayo nag-invest sa DRM plan, yung leakage ng tank umabot sa bubong and tumagos sa isang faulty wiring ay nagkasunog sa museum niyo. So, hindi rin gumana yung smoke, yung alarm, and yung fire systems nyo, yung sprinkler systems nyo. Kasi, again, wala kayong DRM plan. And, of course, yung staff nyo hindi alam mag-respond sa maliit na apoy dahil hindi nyo rin sila natin. Dahil wala rin kayong DRM plan. And wala rin kayong maintenance plan. So, nasunog yung museum nyo. And imagine losing all these, valuable, yung mga importanteng collections sa museums nyo, or for example, sa simbahan nyo, nasunog yung santo or yung image, yung patron ng lugar nyo, nasunog siya dahil sa apoy na nangyari. So, imagine na mawala lahat ng to. Di ba? Ang sakit. Na imagine na in just a snap of your finger, you all lose your valuable collection because you don't have DRM plan, you do not have a periodic maintenance, the response is mabagal. So now, again and again, why do we have to save these heritage assets? Sabi nga ni Ginang Bernina Regalado, ang kultura at kasaysayan ay dapat isa puso. Kailangan natin ma-preserve ito. Dahil ang bayang walang kultura ay bayang walang kaluluwa. So gusto ko lang ulitin yun, ang bayang walang kultura ay bayang walang kaluluwa. So ayokong mabuhay sa isang bayan na walang kaluluwa. So we have to save our cultural heritage assets because our cultural heritage is intergenerational. So ano siya, cultural heritage is intergenerational. It is a product of different generations and we owe it to the next generations na sa balikat natin or we have the responsibility to protect it. Cultural heritage is context specific but could have mass appeal. So, di ba, ang sakit na makita mo halimbawa yung building or yung kunyari, nung nangyari yung 2013 earthquake, Bohol earthquake, ako nasaktan ako na nasira yung mga simbahan na yun. Kahit hindi ako taga Bohol at sakit niya. So, may ganung power yung cultural heritage. Halimbawa rin sa Notre Dame, nasunog siya. 'Di ba? Parang buong mundo na parang nalungkot. So may ganun, may mass appeal yung cultural heritage. That's why we need to protect them. And cultural heritage is living and not fixed in time and place as its uses, value, or form change. So i-emphasize ko lang, cultural heritage is living and not fixed in time and space. So cultural heritage runs with time. And therefore, kailangan natin kumilos ngayon. We have to act now because time is running and so is our cultural heritage. Cultural heritage runs with time. Culture runs with time. And therefore, culture cannot wait. So on behalf of Escuela Talier, maraming salamat po and magandang umaga.
Thank you very much, Architect Querido. That was a very comprehensive and informative and very dense presentation. I think it will take some time for us to absorb everything there. But I appreciate your passion. And I see that you have a very good job security. Hindi ka maubusan ng projects.
Thank you.
I just hope you don't burn out, but your passion will carry you through. Thank you very much again.